All right, so I've been busy working on the assets for my greeting card, and I think I've got it mostly ready in Photoshop. I've got a background, I've got my Cupid, etc. And I've already created a project folder where I've got the assets. And then when I save the project, it'll be right in here. And then I've also created what I would call a support folder, where I've put all of the things that aren't specifically related to my final project. But in case I ever needed to go back to the originals, these are where I got some of the artwork that I put together. Okay, so I wanted to show you what I've done in Photoshop. So this is the Cupid, the original Cupid, who looked something like that. And I isolated the little guy, I isolated one of the hearts, and I flipped him around, and I've also broken apart his arm so that I can play with, and the arrow and the bow, so that I can hopefully get it to look like he is shooting the arrow. And I broke his arm into two parts because when I moved them together it looked really strange. And remember, I'm going to keep this very, very simple and only use techniques that you might be able to figure out at this point with just moving pieces parts around. So I've got my Cupid, and you'll notice that if you looked at him up close, because of the old printing method, he's kind of speckly. That's how they used to create the look of lots of colors with only a few colors, kind of like pointillism. So I did an experiment with the background here, but that's not going to be my real background. I created a long background, much longer than my stage. This is only, we're looking at it at 8%. But if we look at it at 100%, you'll see that it's kind of speckly, and it goes from dark to light. Let me zoom out a little bit here again. So it's got a little bit of that speckliness like the card, and it ends up kind of dark up here and kind of bright down here. So I'm hoping that, you know, my little Cupid's going to start out down here, and slowly this is going to pan upward, ending up in a little bit more dark. I've got my two layers that created this here. I created this by having a mask that was very speckly. And let's look at that at 100%. So that when I do look at the color and I have color behind it, it creates this sort of nice speckly effect. So that's my background, and then I've got the winged cherub who's going to flap his little wings around and fly and get hit by arrows, probably have a heart flying around with him. And when it gets hit by the arrow, it'll turn into my little dark-winged calaveras. You know, I didn't want it to be really scary, so that's why I'm using one of the Mexican painted skulls instead of the skull. But I do end on a gravestone, which I've prepared here. And again, I'm going to turn off the mask so that you can see by shift-clicking on that mask. So here's what the image looks like without the speckliness. Let me hide the guides too. It's an old New England style tombstone, which is where this idea kind of struck me, the similarity between the cherubs and these crazy tombstones. And again, like the background, I've added, and let's get this at 100% too, I've added a mask that has a lot of speckles on it, and that way when you look at the artwork with the mask on it, whatever I put behind this, some of it will come through and it'll keep that sort of feeling that the greeting card originally had. So I think I'm ready. I might need a couple other things, like I think I'm going to need a cloud for in front of my tombstone. Maybe not. I'm going to just go into After Effects now and see how things go. So I'm going to go right into After Effects now, and I'm going to start by building a couple of compositions. Now again, later on there's going to be fancier ways to do some of these things, but I'm doing what you would do now at a very simple level. So I'm going to import a file, and I could do all of them at once, but because they're all different sizes, I want to treat them uniquely and emphasize to you what I'm doing. So this Cupid is the one that has the little Cupid guy with the multiple layers of his arms. So I'm going to import him and retain those layer sizes and say open. I do want this to be a composition. So here it is. It brings in a composition and it brings in all those layers. Now I think there's a few extra layers in this composition. For example, these masks and the very original artwork, which I can delete, but I wanted them to be inside of my original artwork. So I'm just going to delete them here in After Effects where I don't need them and keep everything else. Now I don't even need this green because remember I created a complete other background. So let's go into my composition. Alright, so there's my little chubby guy, and my composition settings should be 1920 by 1080. Yes, because I originally in Photoshop set this up to be the size of my desired video composition. And right now it's set for 14 seconds. I think that's going to be just about right. So what I want to have happen in this composition is actually that I want to try and get the bow to pluck. What I need to do is try and have him in this composition pull his arm back and shoot that arrow. So I'm going to be fading up with him from black over maybe 1 second, and then right at 2 seconds I want to be able to move his arm and his back arm. So here's our transform, and what I'm going to want to do first is play with the position. So there's a fun little thing because these start to get so complicated. I'm going to select these two layers and I'm going to hit the letter P for position, and that way I don't have to see all the transforms. And I'm going to make a keyframe for both of them. In fact, I'm going to make a keyframe at the very beginning too in that same position. And what I want to do, I'm going to hide the bow for the moment so that it doesn't distract me, and also the arrow, is I'm going to make it look as if he's pulling his arm back. So let's say at about 3 seconds, I want his arm to come backward. And because the body's in the way, it's hard, so I'm going to lock my body. And I'm going to grab that little arm and I'm going to pull it back. Now, as that arm pulls back, so let's see how that looks. Yeah, that looks like he's going to shoot the arrow, and then remember he'll just let go and the arrow will fly. So while he's doing that, this back part of his arm should show also, but when I did them together, it was too much. So I'm going to lock the arm, and now I'm going to use this back arm. I'm going to have that back arm pulled back and downward so that it looks like it's his shoulder moving too. Now I'm not sure if I'm seeing, yeah, I'm seeing that arm now come behind his head, which I definitely do not want to do. So I need to move that forward, maybe not pull it back as much. And because it's locked, I have to do this. Okay, and you can also move it with the arrow keys, which is what I'm doing now if you only want to try and move it a little bit at a time. So let's see what that looks like now. If I scrub over it, he pulls his arm back and his shoulder comes down. But then there's a little hiccup. So what do you think might have caused that? Well, I've warned you about this, and here it is, a good example. I actually have two little keyframes. So I'm going to get rid of this one, which is where his arm is sticking out. Let's just delete that keyframe. I just have to select it and delete it. Okay, so I'm ready to add, I'm going to give this just a background to work with, not a real background, but I'm going to check my composition settings and I'm just going to choose kind of a light green color, much like the color that I'll be using, and that'll just help me feel more oriented. I've gotten used to looking at it with the light green. So now I'm going to add the arrow to this mix and see if I can't, I'm going to lock those arms. And let's look at the arrow. I think with the arrow we only need to do a position. So let's see the bow too. We'll eventually move the bow, but at the very beginning, when the arrow is in the hand of the little Cupid, let's make a keyframe there. And then I'm going to use these to get me to the exact keyframe. And then I'm going to use it one more time to have it be another keyframe here, and I will move, let's zoom in a little bit. Move my arrow to go with the hand so that it looks like the hand is pulling back this arrow. So let's see how that looks. Nothing, nothing, and then the hand and the arrow. Now it looks like the arrow is moving back too quickly. And I think part of that is because the position of the arrow at the beginning is not in the hand properly. So I need to move that back into the hand, because you would never hold the shaft of the arrow like that. And if I go to my second keyframe, it looks bad. So I'm going to copy this keyframe, and then I'm going to go to the next spot and I'm going to paste the keyframe. So that's another way that you can create keyframes. Now let's see if it goes back with the hand. That looks much better. So here's what we've got so far. Okay, well, we have the issue of the string, and I'm going to come back to that. But for now, let's just have that pause there, all three of those for a moment, and then the arrow is going to fly, and it's going to go upward. And that will happen very quickly. So once the arrow is released, let's say right about there, I'm going to drag my arrow in kind of a straight line off the screen. And if I want to, I could even add a little bit of an arch to that. But it's going to travel such a little distance. So let's see. So you'll find that you just keep checking and checking, and it's fun because it's that immediate gratification. Choo, off goes the arrow. So I might want to speed that up a little bit, and all I need to do to speed that up is drag my keyframe a little closer, because the less time something has to move, the faster it appears to move. And I couldn't see that with all the stuff, so let's try that again. Just that little part. Yeah, now we're talking. And that's when I'm going to start my pan downward. So I really think that this is how long I want this composition to be. And let's give it till 9 seconds just to be on this complete safe side so that it can pan downward as my sky is moving. So to change the length of my composition, I go to Composition Settings, and instead of having this composition be 14 seconds, I'll just make it 9 seconds long, 09, and I'll say OK. All right, so now I have a 9-second composition, and that should give me time when I put together my master composition. I think I need to speed that up. So tweak, tweak, tweak. Let's grab these frames. And you can grab multiple frames, pull them backward. Grab all of these frames, pull them back. And I'm not going to worry about the length of the composition, but let's take a look at that again, just from the pullback. All right. Okay, we're ready for the next thing. So one of the other important pieces of this Valentine is going to be this little winged cherub who I want to be flapping around. I did the same thing. I I imported the composition with retained layer sizes, and it's essentially just 3 layers. It's the head and then these 2 wings. This composition is not the normal video setting because I don't really need it to be. It's only 600 pixels wide by 259 pixels high, but I realized that I don't have enough room for the wings necessarily to go up, so I'm going to change the height of my composition, maybe up to 300. And it doesn't affect my artwork at all. Right now I've got 9 seconds because it's remembering that from the last composition. I'm just going to once again just throw some of that soft green in the background so that I can see more or less what I'm going to be working on. And I'm going to say OK. So now I have a little bit more room, and what I'm going to do is select all, and I'm going to do P. Remember, that shows me position, but I'm also going to now do R, which is going to give me rotation. I don't need rotation on the head, but I do need it on the wings. So let's get back to P also, and I'm going to need a position for each of these. Okay, so let me grab all 3 pieces parts and move them down. So all I want to do in this composition is have the wings move up and down and up and down and up and down. And I'm thinking multiple flaps within 2 seconds. So let's say a half a second up, a half a second down, or a little less than half a second. So remember, there's 30 frames per second. If I zoom all the way in here, I can see all the way down to the frames. So half a second would be about 15 frames. I'm going to go ahead and just do it every, like, say 10 frames, which is less than a second. All right, so I'm going to select these again. I'm going to do rotation. Now, if I were to just rotate these right now, remember that it's going to rotate on this axis point. So, for example, if I rotate that wing, that's not exactly what I'm after. So let's move the fulcrum point so that it flaps from sort of this point here. And I'll do that on the other wing as well. Remember, it's this pan behind anchor point tool. So I brought it on this one to a little below the ear. I'm going to do the same on this one. And so now when I go and I make the rotation from here on forward, I will be able to rotate on that specific spot. So I'm going to go out to frame 10. I'm going to make a new keyframe. And I'm just going to do this visually by using the slider. So I'm going to put the wings up, and I'll do the same thing here, only if I go to 24, guess what? It rotates in the same direction, so I need to go minus 24. Okay, so now I have these 2 keyframes, and that's more or less what I want. So obviously once it gets here, I want it to go back to these keyframes. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit now, and I'm going to grab each of these keyframes. Sadly, we have to do each layer at a time. So we can do these 2 and then paste them there. And then same thing, come out a little further, paste them. Now later on we would do something that's called loop out, but for now this should do what we need it to do. We can even at this point zoom way out, and as long as it's all on one layer, I can copy all of these keyframes, hold down the Shift key, click on each one, Command C, go a little further out, Command V, Command V. And I'm going to use up the full 9 seconds. Okay, so you get the idea. I'm going to repeat on the other wing and come back then.